Now, once a judge has decided that you can't really be dealt with without sending you to prison, a sentence of prison may be imposed. Sometimes that will be just a sentence of 1 day in prison, which you'll see in criminal records. Now, it's important to understand what this actually means. It doesn't actually mean you go to jail for this. It's just that the judge is using this sentence as a way to communicate to future judges. The judge is saying this person's being sentenced to 1 day in jail, and they're serving it by actually being in court here today, right? So you see on this guy's criminal record, it's got failure to comply with the probation order. Previously, this person didn't have any prison sentences, but then this shows up 1 day conc. That means concurrent with this other sentence here. 1 day time served again in court. So these two things, they're both getting concurrent sentences of 1 day. That means running at the same time, these two 1 day sentences. That's saying, okay, you being here in court, that counts as jail time, and this is the last chance you'll get, because the next judge who comes along and sees your criminal record and sees this 1 day on here is going to know that I gave you a chance and that you've been already had your final warning. So we're going to come up with something heavier. Now, what that might be is probably not in this guy's case, probably not going to be a conditional sentence of imprisonment. Conditional sentence of imprisonment is kind of controversial. It's relatively new in the criminal system, which is to say, I think it's about 25 years now that it's been there. And it's essentially house arrest. It's what people would call house arrest, even though that's kind of inaccurate. It's only under certain circumstances where it can be administered, essentially for non-violent crimes. It has to be for a sentence that's less than 2 years, and that there's no bodily harm that anyone has suffered as a result of your offense. And so the court may decide that you have to serve your prison sentence inside your house, or as it's called, in the community. Now, there's reasons why this program is in place and why it's considered in many ways a good idea. It's very inexpensive relative to incarcerating people. It's meant to be reserved for cases where the person has a very low risk of reoffending, where they don't present a danger to the community that they're in. So it's really more where people are very humiliated. This is considered to be a good option because it often will allow them to continue working. So if most people who are going in front of a judge to be sentenced don't have jobs, and if somebody does have a steady job, and especially a house and a family and so on, then the social fallout of that person losing their job and being sent to jail, it can actually be pretty severe for the other people and their family and for the rest of society by extension. Now, you might be thinking, well, tough. We shouldn't be coddling them, right? Those are the consequences that follow. You're part of your family. It's too bad for your family, but they may just have to move on without you. All of these are points certainly worth discussing. Especially these days, I'm wondering to what extent that the whole regime of the conditional sentence of imprisonment is going to be revisited after the pandemic, because so much of the logic of the conditional sentence of imprisonment is that it's considered to be very punishing to have to be stuck inside your house, that this is an actual legitimate form of prison. And so when people might be saying after all this, look, if technically I think we've all been serving conditional sentences of imprisonment because of the curfew, you might say, well, no, that must be very different from house arrest. Not really. If you look at the conditions that apply in a conditional sentence of imprisonment, the first third of the sentence has some strict conditions, and then in the second third it eases up, and the last third is effectively almost a probation order. The conditions allow you to leave your house to go to work, so it's not really house arrest in the sense of you can't leave your house. You're allowed to go to work. You're allowed. There are exceptions built in for allowing you to go shopping, allowing you to go to your place of worship. Like if you're a Christian, then you can build a window in on Sundays, on Friday nights for Jews, and on Saturday nights for Muslims. Overall, this whole regime is meant to build around the idea of rehabilitation, that you're really being denounced by getting a longer sentence, but putting you in prison isn't really going to help much of anyone. It's going to be expensive. Now, something that most people don't understand is that conditional sentence of imprisonment, if you're not going to be able to respect those conditions, is actually a really bad idea for you. Because if you get busted for breaching your conditions on a conditional sentence of imprisonment, then the length of time to which you are sentenced gets converted to that time in actual prison. You might say, well, how does that change anything? It's that typically judges aren't supposed to do this, but in practice they do, that when they sentence you for actual prison time, they'll sentence you for less time than if they're sentencing you under a conditional sentence order. If they're sentencing you to 3 months in regular jail, that might translate to more something like 18 months in a conditional sentence. So if you're sentenced to 18 months, you're like, hooray, house arrest. Then you get busted a month in. Now you're serving 18 months when you could have been serving 3. So it could be a problem. In terms of an actual sentence in prison, depending on how long your sentence is, it will be served in different systems. If it's a sentence of less than 2 years, it'll be in a provincial prison. Provincial prisons have some disadvantages in that often the programs in place aren't as elaborate or as developed as they would be in federal penitentiaries. But at the same time, if you ask most criminals, they would prefer to serve in provincial prisons. And in part, it's because you'd assume that criminals who are being sentenced to long periods of jail would be pretty tough-skinned, but a lot of them are really sensitive to the other people who are in jail with them. They compare the sort of roommates that they would have in a provincial prison, and they say, I would much rather be serving jail time with these people than with the crazies in a federal penitentiary. I've heard criminals explain this to me, saying, please, I don't want to go back to Stony Mountain or one of these places out in the prairies. They just find the gangs there so much more violent. They'll find the conditions, even if there's more training in place because you're going to be there for a long time, they say it's just too dangerous. My roommate is likely to be crazy. I don't want to be next to somebody like that. There's also, if you're in a provincial prison, it's going to be in your own province, whereas in a federal penitentiary, you might be all the way across the country. If you've got family who might be likely to visit you, then the fact that you're 3,000 miles away can make a big difference.